Hi, everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition podcast, in which we talk all things sustainability with some of the most distinguished experts in the cannabis industry. I'm your host, Rodrigo Pereira, VP of Product Management at GrowIQ. Today, I'll be talking with Brooke Butler and Caitlin Edwards from Simplifya. Brooke is VP of Partnerships, and Caitlin is a regulatory analyst. Brooke and Caitlin will discuss regulatory frameworks, GMP, and how it affects the ability of cannabis companies to structure and implement sustainability in practical ways within their operation in the bounds of these regulations. They'll also discuss how Simplifya is helping operators navigate these regulatory hurdles. There's a ton of insight in the conversation you don't want to miss. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to a new episode of the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition podcast. Joining us today are Brooke Butler and Caitlin Edwards from Simplifya. Brooke is the VP of Partnerships at Simplifya, and Caitlin is a regulatory analyst. Brooke and Caitlin, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Hello, thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get started, and there's probably a lot of our listeners that may not be familiar with Simplifya. It'd be great, maybe Brooke, if you could give us a little bit of background on the company, and then then we'll kind of transition to hear both of your personal backgrounds and stories.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Simplifya, we are a software tool that was actually kind of the brainchild of the Vicente Sederberg law firm based out of Colorado, where we're headquartered, back in 2016. And what they realized was after Colorado transitioned into the recreational adult use market from just being medical, there was a lot of new entrants or licensees that wanted to be compliant, but that hadn't been tasked with reading through 473 pages of legal narrative to figure out all the things they can and can't do. And so Simplifya was created to be a really easy to use, affordable software solution to help anyone that is trying to operate in the licensed and heavily regulated market be able to survive and really thrive without having to spend every second focused on learning and staying up to date with all of the compliance changes that they are up against. And so we help clients self-audit their business against their state and their local regs. We have really wonderful standard operating procedure templates that can help a company get licensed for their application part of that process, or maintain it once they are operational. And then we have a great document management system, a wonderful, robust license and badge tracker. And we also have products that now serve financial institutions, governments, and we've also moved into the payment space. That's our newest offering. And so we are all focused kind of on really eliminating any challenge that companies face in that compliance space. I kind of joke with everybody that we're the good, bad guys in the industry. We're doing the stuff that nobody wants to do or really use, but somebody has to.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think from seeing it from over here in Massachusetts, I mean, you sort of look at the burden some of these companies that are starting up have to go through, and just imagine having that tool is incredibly valuable.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to be.
Yeah. And so Brooke, just if you don't mind going into a little bit how you got into the cannabis industry, I guess what are some of your interests in that area, within cannabis and sustainability?
Yeah, well, I'm kind of a weird character. I before cannabis, I actually spent over a decade abroad, actually doing kind of macroeconomic research on emerging markets. And so I've lived in countries like Nigeria and Sri Lanka and the Philippines, and been able to do a lot of really interesting things. And so I've always been a policy and kind of a red nerd. But as far as sustainability goes, I have always been interested in it from as far as how regulations play a role in sustainability. Because when I was living in Nigeria, whenever we would go down to the Niger Delta, one of the things that really just drove me nuts was the fact that all the big oil, stuff down there, they were all flaring gas because it was actually cheaper to pay the fine to flare the gas than it was to do all of the like regulatory steps to actually get rid of it properly. And so for me, like I love puzzles like that, but because it's so interesting to me that like if you leave a company up to it, like they're 9 times out of 10 going to go the profitable route. They're not going to go the sustainability route. So for me, I'm really interested in, what role regulations can play in sustainability.
Fantastic. And that's that sounds awfully familiar just from my upbringing.
Yeah.
So I grew up in Mexico, and I saw a lot of that too.
It's just, it really hurts your head.
Yeah. So Caitlin, I guess I want to pass it over to you, and the same question, maybe if you can give us a little bit of background as to how you got into the cannabis industry and some of your interest in sustainability within cannabis.
Yeah, definitely. So I got my start in the cannabis industry actually as an intern when I was in college. A local cannabis company had promoted an internship. They had the CU Boulder or University of Colorado Boulder Business School. And at the time, and still to this day, I was very interested in the intersection between business and government and how a business can be profitable, as well as stay within the regulatory red tape that's in place. And obviously the cannabis industry exemplifies that perfectly. So I thought that was super interesting. So I applied for that internship and ended up getting the internship. And then when I graduated college, they hired me on full time. This company, they're a vertically integrated multi-state cannabis operator. So, they have dispensaries, both medical and recreational, cultivation facilities and manufacturing facilities. So, they hired me on full time, where I did compliance and licensing work, as well as I was their community liaison. So I was essentially the middleman between the community organizations that the company worked with, as well as the local government and city council, stuff like that. So then I transitioned a couple of years ago to a regulatory analyst at Simplifia, and the name, regulatory analyst pretty much describes what I do, analyzing, researching, comprehending all of the regulations in place that cannabis companies throughout the country have to abide by, and essentially translating it into content that is easy to understand, that our clients buy from us or use via our software platform. And in terms of sustainability, I'd say what interests me the most with that in terms of the cannabis industry is definitely with my time at the company that I was talking about earlier that hired me on after college and that I interned for. They were based in Boulder, Colorado. And Boulder, I'm not sure if you know this or listeners know this, but it's a very progressive green place where sustainability is very key. So I was introduced to that very firsthand with working for that company, as how are we going to stay within all the regulatory requirements, as well as be profitable in terms of sustainability, and then also be above be the first company in the area that's doing these sustainable things, so that we have a competitive advantage and a competitive edge. And I'll get into that a little bit later on, but I'd say that's definitely where my interest in sustainability in terms of cannabis came about.
Awesome. No, that's fantastic, Caitlin. And yeah, I think what's interesting here and talk about your background is that I think having been, I guess, on the customer side of things, it probably gives you much more, say, empathy to what they're going through, and you sort of help develop a product that can really companies can really leverage and ultimately help them kind of navigate these regulatory waters.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I think that gives us a really good pivot point to my first question. And Brooke, this one's for you. I mean, so we were just talking about regulatory burdens, and obviously operators already face quite a bit in multiple of these regulatory burdens. Do you think it's fair for cannabis companies to expect to pursue sustainability in what's already a really regulated and sort of expensive market?
Great question. I mean, sadly, yes. It is not something that any industry including cannabis, is going to be able to turn away from and not make significant strides towards, over the coming years and decades. And, like you said, there's really two big challenges, though, when you talk about sustainability in cannabis, though, and what these operators are up against. First off, sustainability was not exactly on the top of the to-do list of the regulators when they initially, legalized and subsequently regulated their industry. Their main priorities were, really clamping down on the illicit market and, of course, public safety. And so you've got that, it wasn't built into those original set of regs, which, as you mentioned, were plentiful. There's, I always use this, and I feel crazier every time I say it, but they have regulated cannabis more than plutonium, if you can imagine, right? So you hit the nail on the head. Like, they've got a million regs to deal with, and before sustainability is layered in there.
Yep.
And then second, and this is probably the bigger issue, is in many, if not most states, cannabis regulators and environmental programs typically operate completely separately, which often results in environmental permits being overlooked until long after licenses have been obtained. Or the other thing that you can think about is when it comes to money, right? Like you said, these operators have a huge hurdle to overcome just to get compliant. And so if they're only budgeting for the regs that are there now, and they're not keeping cash on hand that they're going to have to burn through to keep up with what regs are coming down the pipe, then they've gone through all that work to get a license, but won't be able to keep up with those other reg sets that they're going to have to deal with later on. Like if a water board comes in or an environmental protection agency and things like that. So, it's tough, but the one thing I can say is we are starting to see more of that built into the regs, because as more states and countries started to legalize, they've been confronted with the reality, and there's no getting around it. But, cannabis does use huge amounts of pesticides, energy, water, and packaging waste, part of the supply chain. And what really shocked me was, I think that the number of something like 10,000 tons of packaging waste was generated by cannabis sales in the first year of legalization in Canada. Wow. 10,000 tons.
Wow.
And that's partly because they've regulated it that way. Like in some states, you have to have, a plastic child-resistant bottle inside a child-resistant package and child-resistant bag. That's 3 or 4 layers of plastic that are having to be used before somebody even walks out the door. And so, we should see more of this evolve, but it's a tough operating environment for cannabis companies, no matter what way you look at it.
Yeah, no, I think those are some really good examples, Brooke. And Caitlin, I think this sort of brings me to the next question, which is you worked with a large licensed operator, MSO. Guess what were some of your experience with sustainability? I think both in terms of the compliance aspects with regulatory requirements and also the business practices.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, the cannabis company that I had worked for was based out of Boulder, Colorado. So in Boulder, both the county and the city, they require that marijuana facilities report their energy use and offset their consumption through one of 3 ways. The first one being installing a renewable energy facility. The second way is to participate in a verified solar garden, or you can pay into a city fund. So this is a really good example of a pretty burdensome regulatory requirement that a cannabis facility at the local level would have to abide by. And I just wanted to break those 3 ways down a little bit, just to highlight actually like how burdensome it actually ended up being, and kind of how this exemplifies a failure, in my opinion, on part of a local jurisdiction in terms of how are we going to monitor cannabis facilities, regulate them, and have the initiative be sustainability. So for installing a renewable energy facility, I mean, you're looking at like a $500,000 minimum bill in order to do that. So that, at least for my company that I used to work for, our purposes, was not going to happen. No way. Then for the solar garden, so participating in a solar garden essentially means you're buying kind of a piece of a solar energy garden, and you're contributing to that. But unfortunately, at the time, no solar gardens were available. They had already been all taken up. So that was an option. So the only option we had left was to pay into this offset fund. No one in the industry in Boulder was clear as to where this money was going. It ended up being a ton of money that our company was paying into, and just in general, they were getting a ton of money. It was almost like a tax without
being called a tax.
Being called a tax, and it just didn't seem particularly fair. So yeah, I think that this energy offset fund in Boulder was definitely my most prominent example of sustainability in the cannabis industry, and like how it can sometimes fail, and sometimes it's, I don't think regulatory bodies don't take into account all the burdens that cannabis organizations have to face. The initial barriers to entry, the financial burdens, the compliance costs. So adding sustainability requirements on top of that can be a lot. So I think that regulatory bodies have to think about that in a very thorough way that's both, taking into consideration, of course, the environment and consumers, but also businesses themselves. So, and then as far as internal business practices that I saw working for a licensed operator, it was definitely, all about staying ahead of the curve at this point, because I think, as Brooke mentioned, sustainability requirements, if they aren't happening yet, they're coming down the pipeline. So the company that I worked for was very aware of that, and also was aware of the competitive advantages that came with being a sustainable company. So they used eco-friendly containers composed of recycled milk jug plastic, and they used LED lighting in their cultivation facilities. They had recycling units at the dispensaries for customers to use, and they had an intense monitoring procedure in terms of water use in place for their cultivation facilities as well. And again, none of these were required by the state or local government, but it was just their way of staying ahead of the curve in order to be sustainable, knowing that that's going to be required at some point another.
So I think your two examples are super interesting, Caitlin, from a perspective of, on the one hand, you have these sort of good intentions, but then unintended consequences in terms of really paying into this fund and not knowing what was happening with that money. But then also, conversely, sort of the company taking charge and really applying some of these sustainability practices by themselves.
Yeah, exactly. I think those two examples paint that picture very well.
Yeah, Caitlin. So, as far as I understand, you're also Simplify as resident GMP expert. So, do you see any overlap between GMP and sustainability?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I want to give a quick overview of GMP, as not maybe every listener knows exactly what that means. So GMP stands for Good Manufacturing Practices. It's actually a globally accepted system of regulations surrounded around quality control and quality assurance and overall consumer safety. In the United States, it's referred to as CGMP, so Current Good Manufacturing Practices, and it's overseen by the FDA. And usually it's in regards to the pharmaceutical industry. So the companies that are producing pharmaceuticals and vaccines, we're seeing right now. So because cannabis is illegal at the federal level, the FDA does not regulate cannabis companies, and therefore cannabis companies are not forced to abide by these FDA GMP regulations. But we're seeing more so than ever, and that local governments and state governments are requiring both medical and adult use cannabis markets to follow these GMP guidelines. And as we were talking about earlier, a lot of companies are starting to, even without these regulatory requirements, abide by GMP because they know that it's coming down the pipeline and they want to stay ahead of the curve. So with that all being said, GMP, because it's focused on quality and consumer safety, inherently environmental aspects and sustainability as a whole come into play. Although environmentalism and sustainability is not a principle of GMP, GMP does include many aspects kind of related to the environment. Big one is waste, and handling waste and hazardous substances. and as well as wastewater management. So I think enacting GMP will inherently allow a company to practice sustainability and vice versa. And I also think there's a lot of room and a lot of potential for GMP to incorporate more and more practices that are very sustainable or based off of sustainability. I was reading up on it actually before we hopped on this podcast, and the World Health Organization, which oversees GMP at the global level, they're actually right now going through a process, a rulemaking and a hearing process to get some feedback from stakeholders regarding sustainability and adding more sustainable regulations in their GMP guidelines. So that's something that's interesting, and interesting to see what the future holds for GMP and sustainability.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it seems like, in some ways, like you said, maybe it's not directly part of GMP, but there's probably some implications from, following these practices. And not only, I think, the sustainability from the environmental point of view, but also from the business kind of sustainability point of view.
Yeah, definite overlap. And I think they both also being sustainable and being GMP compliant offer competitive advantages and offer potential for increased product quality.
Yeah, absolutely. Brooke, so sort of going back to one of the things that Caitlin was talking about, some of the for example, the kind of regulatory agency and the effect it had on the LP that she worked at. I guess, what are some of the things that you're currently seeing from state regulatory agencies, and how, going back to sustainability, how are they addressing that?
Yeah, it's, we're starting to see, in my opinion, some encouraging signs, and the biggest thing for me again goes back to operators, kind of thinking about issues like sustainability at the beginning of their, programs when they start to come up with their regulations, because, as Kayla mentioned, that lets the operators know up front before they get into the business what regulations and the cost associated with those they will be up against. So I think the sooner we get to that, the better. And you're already seeing some of it. You're seeing them not only let people know what's in it, but also reward them if they're being sustainable. So like in Illinois, and they passed, I believe, recreational last year. They actually, said they were factoring environmental planning, including conservation and efficiency efforts, into the scoring of cultivation center applications. So that's a really positive step and sign, and a way to do it right. You're letting them know what they're up against, but you're also incentivizing them to do better and go further with that. Because as with all regulations in cannabis, they kind of typically always kind of start small, and then you end up getting more regulations as they come. So I think that's good. And for your legacy states, like Colorado or Oregon and, things like that, you are seeing those, sets of regulations be continually, revised and changed, but you're seeing more sustainability built into those changes now. And so, in Oregon, as an example, growers have to prove that they have a legal source of water. They've got much stricter water requirements. I think increasing across probably lots of different states in the country, which is good to see. And then states like Michigan, as an example, they've adopted rules on things like industrial water, wastewater, water resources, and land management, and those type of things for cannabis growers. And I know Caitlin mentioned waste earlier. In my opinion, Colorado used to have just not a great sustainability program at all when it came to the waste regulations. And we've seen them revise those as well. And so that's always good to see too. I think the more we see regulators being, transparent and building in sustainability up front as they legalize, that's great. But we also want to make sure, since over half the country has at least some form of medical, programs now, that those states aren't becoming stagnant and are evolving with the times. And the great thing I would say, in tandem with that, is you've really seen our industry rise and meet the challenges of creating sustainable products. And so you've got lots of ancillary companies, like I'll think of, my friends over at Sana Packaging, they're using 100% recycled, I think hemp plastic for their bottles. And so you're seeing, both regulations come up, but the private industry start really coming up with products that are just going to go ahead and make it easier for companies to, be sustainable going forward as well.
Yeah, and that's I think that's super interesting point in terms of like you really thinking about this in terms of like these sort of monolithic regulations that can't change, but on the one hand, states realizing that they have to change them to adapt, but then also obviously private industries taking that initiative and saying like we're gonna sort of lead the way on this, and especially as you think about like really big markets like New York coming online, well now basically.
Yeah.
No, that's super interesting.
And I would say, sustainability is going to be an issue that either causes this country to get closer to legalization or not. Because think about it, if everybody's biggest fear with cannabis is like, oh my gosh, the streets are just going to be filled with cannabis and it's going to be, just it smells like it, there's going to be waste everywhere. And so, if we're not just littering the streets with cannabis, packaging and stuff like that, people are not going to think we're, destroying the world. More states legalize. So it really is a social, issue for our industry as well.
Yeah, no, so, and I can sort of attest to that personally. I live like a few blocks from a dispensary, and you don't even notice it, which is kind of fun. No, those are really good points. So sort of in the same vein of regulation, sustainability, I think when you have to go about putting sustainability practices in place, you usually always talk about standard operating procedures or SOPs. So I think Caitlin, this is more for you. What SOPs should licensed producers take into account as they kind of make sustainability practices part of their operation?
Yeah. At Simplify, I'm one of the main standard operating procedure SOP drafters. So I deal with SOPs pretty much all day, every day. And I just want to give just an overview on SOPs as far as they relate to the cannabis industry in general. At least I think for most standard operating procedures, but definitely can say this for Simplify standard operating procedures, they integrate both state-specific regulatory requirements as well as operational best practices in order to create easy-to-follow documents that outline policies and procedures that employees on all levels of the organization can follow. And also SOPs, more likely than not, are going to be required for your initial license applications as a cannabis business, and they're also more likely than not going to be a part of your subsequent renewal process, meaning that the regulatory agency that oversees your operation is going to want to see these standard operating procedures. So it's very important that they're well written and integrate the regulatory requirements and best practices. Regulators also may request to see these SOPs during an audit. So again, just highlighting the importance of SOPs. But as far as sustainability goes, a cannabis organization can implement standard operating procedures to reduce energy waste, let's say, or increase sustainability just as a whole. And also they may be just actually required by regulators to do this. I see a lot of the times in these regulatory sets that cannabis companies have to follow, they have to have environmental plans. So us at Simplify use our standard operating procedures as a tool to enact these environmental plans. So we do this in Illinois, we do it in Massachusetts, Nevada, and Missouri. So those regulations that say, okay, you have to have environmental plans in place. And then we go through and read that and see, okay, it's a plan, therefore we could use our standard operating procedures to write out this plan in the form of an SOP, and it will highlight all of the sustainable best practices as well as the regulatory requirements. And then a lot of categories covered in SOPs in general, but specifically Simplify SOPs that relate to sustainability include waste, which is what we talked about earlier, fibrous waste SOPs, consumer waste SOPs, hazardous waste SOPs. We also have SOPs that pertain to air quality and environmental controls, especially with solvent use for manufacturers. Solvent uses can be not very great for air quality. So you can use standard operating procedures to kind of mitigate that. And with odor control and odor control plans, packaging and the waste associated with packaging, again, as we were talking about earlier, and quality control and quality insurance in general. So yeah, so the qualities associated with standard operating procedures, such as saving time and training costs and reducing risk, increasing productivity, controlling consistency, and controlling product quality, combined with the willingness of a licensed operator to pursue sustainable operations, make SOPs, in my opinion, a great resource for achieving compliant and sustainable cannabis operations.
Yeah, and that's super interesting. And it seems like, from my perspective, there should probably be kind of like an impetus from licensed operators to sort of want to do this, because if you think about scaling a business, the more you have sort of recorded on paper, it reduces your variability, and like you said, in processes and how you do one thing from site to site. So it seems like also kind of advantageous thing from a business perspective.
Yeah, oh, for sure. Yeah, regardless of what regulatory requirements are in place, I think a business should have standard operating procedures regardless. And, just to connect it back to GMP as well, I mean, that is a requirement of good manufacturing practices, is to have solid standard operating procedures in place, as well as just good documentation practices in general. So I think all of these intertwine in a really interesting way that can be really advantageous for cannabis companies.
Absolutely. So I'm coming, to sort of the end of the podcast, but Brooke, you've seen, you have exposure to a ton of the different markets and obviously regulatory frameworks. But from the sustainability side, what do you consider the future of sustainability in the cannabis industry to be? What's your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I still really believe that, our industry still has the opportunity to really kind of, lead by example from the outset. I know we're not, at the complete outset yet, but we're still in the second inning, right, of the baseball game. Mm-hmm. And, I think we really could raise the bar for, more sustainable best management practices that you see, in corporations. I mean, imagine if that was what we're known for as an industry. I mean, that gets rid of the naysayers that are against this real quick, or at least partly, right?
Yep.
But I think the other big thing that, we've already started to see a little bit of, and I touched on this, but I think you're going to see really, hopefully, a lot more of going forward, is sustainability playing more of a role as far as, points or scoring new applications. So if you want to, expand your business or open up a brand new facility, you will have to prove that you are, putting good energy efficiency in place, using water, respectfully and responsibly, and those type of things. And people will get rewarded based on that. And so I think that, that's going to help really speed things along a lot faster than saying, hey, these are the bare minimum regs that you have to do once you're already licensed. So I think that's going to be the thing that you see a shift towards more this year. And we've got I think nearly 10 states now that are about to come up with their, new recreational, medical regulatory regimes. And it'll be interesting to see how that is built into those states that are coming up right now.
Yeah, no, that's really, again, just a really great perspective, Brooke. And I want to, I guess, thank you both for your time. This has been such an amazing conversation. I mean, I think usually when people think about the cannabis industry, regulatory frameworks is not something that, might be like their first thought, but it's such a critical part of the process. And obviously for people that are looking to get a license and organizations that are looking to let us get a license, it's, obviously critical to have that in mind and have, products like Simplifya that can help ease that and kind of shepherd them through that whole process.
Yeah, I mean, the sad but true, joke that I make is, unfortunately, when you get into cannabis, you're not actually running a cannabis business. You're in charge of running a compliance business. And if you do compliance well, then you get to, have fun with the cannabis. And so it's not fun. But like I said, that's why we're here. We're the good bad guys.
Yeah, awesome. So I think we'll leave it with that thought. Brooke, Caitlin, thank you so much for your time. It's been just an absolute pleasure talking with both of you.
Yeah, our pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition podcast. If you like what you heard, tune into our next episode and make sure to check out our content on our website at sustainablecannabiscoalition.com and make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Yep, we're pretty much everywhere. Till next time.